Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. 6 months. That's how long I spent researching the perfect color for my house. Not because I'm obsessive, though my wife might disagree, but because when you buy a 1920s Mediterranean revival home in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the state, you don't just slap some random color on it and call it a day. I'm what you'd call a software entrepreneur who got lucky. Not billionaire lucky, but comfortable enough that when I saw this house with its original terracotta tiles and wrought iron details, I knew I had to have it. The previous owners had done their best to maintain it, but 30 years of quick fixes had left it needing serious restoration work. The HOA in this community is legendary, not in a good way. When we first toured the neighborhood, the realtor spent more time explaining the association rules than she did showing us the actual houses. 47 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Everything from the height of your grass to the exact shade of white you could use for window trim was regulated down to the smallest detail, but I'm detail-oriented by nature. Building software companies teaches you to read the fine print, follow procedures, and document everything. So I figured I could work with their system. After all, these rules existed to preserve property values and maintain the character of the neighborhood, right? Wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The paint research started the day we closed on the house. I spent hours in the local historical society poring over original architectural plans and period photographs. I consulted with restoration experts, studied color palettes from the 1920s, and even tracked down the original paint specifications from the builder's records. What I found was fascinating. The house had originally been painted in what the 1920s catalogs called deep Mediterranean blue. It wasn't garish or bright, but a sophisticated, rich shade that complemented the terracotta roof tiles perfectly. Think of the color of the ocean just before sunset, deep and complex but not overwhelming. I found the closest modern equivalent in a premium paint line. The color was called historical indigo, and it was absolutely perfect. Not too dark, not too bright, historically accurate, and gorgeous against the cream-colored stucco walls. Following the HOA procedures to the letter, I prepared my application. The submission packet was a masterpiece of documentation. Color swatches, historical research, photographs of similar period homes, even a letter from a restoration specialist confirming the historical accuracy. I included receipts showing I was buying the highest quality exterior paint available, not some cheap option that would fade or chip. The whole process took 2 weeks to put together properly. I submitted everything through the official channels and waited for approval. The rules stated that all applications would be reviewed within 30 days, with approval being granted unless there were specific documented reasons for rejection. 32 days later, I got my answer. The rejection letter was brief and condescending. The HOA president, a woman I'll call the board president, claimed my color choice was inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic and too intense for the harmonious visual environment we work to maintain. The letter went on to state that I needed to select from one of 3 approved color options. All 3 were variations of what I can only describe as builder's beige, bland, generic, soulless colors that would make my beautiful Mediterranean revival home look like every other cookie-cutter house in suburbia. I read the rejection twice, then pulled out my copy of the HOA rules. Nowhere in the 47 pages of regulations could I find specific guidelines about paint colors being too intense or requirements for harmonious visual environments. The rules mentioned that colors should be appropriate to the architectural style and come from approved manufacturers, but that was it. What really got my attention was a small detail I noticed during my research phase. 3 houses in the neighborhood already had colors very similar to my historical indigo. One was actually darker, but all 3 had been painted before the current board took power, so apparently they were grandfathered in under some unwritten rule. The hypocrisy was stunning, but what really bothered me was the arbitrary nature of the decision. I had followed every rule, submitted proper documentation, and chosen a historically appropriate color. The rejection seemed to be based entirely on the personal preferences of the board president. I decided to dig deeper into the HOA documentation, not just the basic homeowner packet they give everyone, but the original governing documents, board meeting minutes, and every amendment that had been passed over the years. What I found in those documents changed everything. The paint regulations were more complex than the summary version suggested. Colors had to be appropriate to architectural style, which I clearly met, but they also had to come from approved manufacturers as listed in Appendix J of the original covenants. Appendix J was fascinating reading. It listed 17 paint manufacturers that were acceptable for use in the neighborhood. The list had been created in 1987 when the HOA was established, and as far as I could tell, had never been updated. Most of the companies on the list were major national brands that still existed, but 3 of them caught my attention. They were smaller, regional companies that either no longer existed or had been absorbed by larger corporations. The rules didn't specify that the list would be updated regularly or that defunct companies would be removed. One company in particular stood out. Heritage Tints Inc. had been a small, family-owned paint manufacturer based about 2 states over. According to my research, they had specialized in historically accurate colors for restoration projects, perfect for my needs, except for one small problem. They had gone out of business in 2019, or had they? A deeper dive into business records showed that Heritage Tints Inc. still existed as a legal entity. The family had closed their manufacturing operations and laid off their employees, but they had never actually dissolved the corporation. The company name, trademarks, and all their paint formulations were just sitting there, dormant but legally intact. And it was for sale. I spent the next week researching Heritage Tints thoroughly. The company had a solid reputation in the restoration community and had developed some truly beautiful color formulations over their 60-year history. Their deep Mediterranean blue was almost identical to my historical indigo. More importantly, Heritage Tints Inc. was explicitly listed in Appendix J of our HOA covenants as an approved manufacturer. My wife thought I had lost my mind when I first explained my plan. Buy a defunct paint company just to paint our house? It seemed excessive even by my standards. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. The purchase price was reasonable. Not cheap, but for someone in my position, definitely affordable. I would be buying the company name, all their paint formulations, equipment that was in storage, and most importantly, all their intellectual property and trademarks. And once I owned Heritage Tints, I could do whatever I wanted with it. I contacted the family through a business broker and made an offer. They were thrilled to find someone interested in preserving their father's legacy, and the negotiations went smoothly. Within 6 weeks, I was the proud owner of Heritage Tints, Inc. The first thing I did was rename the company. Heritage Tints became HOA Color Standards Corporation. I updated all the business registrations, filed new trademark applications, and created a professional website showcasing our premium color solutions for discerning communities. The second thing I did was rename my paint color. Deep Mediterranean Blue became HOA Blue Community Harmony Collection. I printed professional color cards, created technical specification sheets, and even developed a whole marketing campaign around bringing harmony to neighborhood aesthetics. The transformation took 2 months to complete properly. When it was done, I had a legitimate paint manufacturing company with a professional grade color called HOA Blue that was explicitly produced by a manufacturer listed in Appendix J of our HOA covenants. I was ready to paint my house. The notification letter I sent to the HOA was a work of art, written by my corporate attorney and delivered by certified mail. It informed the board that I would be proceeding with my exterior painting project using HOA Blue from HOA Color Standards Corporation. The letter included professional documentation showing that HOA Color Standards Corporation was the successor entity to Heritage Tints Inc., which was explicitly listed as an approved manufacturer in the HOA covenants. It also included technical specifications for HOA Blue demonstrating that it met all requirements for exterior paint durability and coverage. Most importantly, the letter made it clear that any interference with my painting project would be met with immediate legal action for tortious interference and bad faith enforcement of HOA regulations. The response was predictable. 3 days after I started painting, I received a cease and desist order from the board president. The letter claimed that my color was still inappropriate and threatened daily fines of $500 until I corrected the violation. That's when my attorney sent the second letter. This one was longer and more detailed. It explained that Heritage Tints Inc. was explicitly approved in the HOA covenants, that company name changes do not invalidate manufacturer approvals, and that HOA Blue was now an official color standard produced by an approved vendor. But here's where it got interesting. The letter also pointed out that according to the HOA rules, all paint colors in the neighborhood had to come from approved manufacturers. A quick survey of recent paint jobs showed that several homeowners had used paint from companies not listed in Appendix J. Either the HOA had to enforce their rules consistently and fairly, or they had to admit that their enforcement was arbitrary and discriminatory. The letter concluded by offering the HOA two options. They could approve my paint job and acknowledge that HOA Color Standards Corporation was a legitimate approved vendor, or they could prepare for a comprehensive audit of every paint job in the neighborhood and face potential litigation from every homeowner who had unknowingly violated the approved manufacturer requirement. While I waited for their response, I got to work on phase 2 of my plan. If I was going to own a paint company, I might as well make it successful. I reached out to other homeowners in the neighborhood and offered them a special discount on HOA blue and other colors from my newly acquired formulation catalog. The response was overwhelming. It turned out that a lot of people were tired of being limited to the 3 approved beige shades. When I offered them historically appropriate alternatives that were technically compliant with HOA rules, they jumped at the chance. Within a month, I had sold enough paint for 12 houses to be painted in various shades of HOA blue. Light HOA blue for the Colonial Revival house on the corner, sage HOA blue for the Craftsman bungalow down the street, pewter HOA blue for the Tudor Revival next to the park. Every single color came from an approved manufacturer and was technically compliant with HOA regulations. But the overall effect was to break the beige monopoly that had dominated the neighborhood for decades. The board president was furious. She called an emergency board meeting and sent out a notice that all recent paint jobs were under review and might face fines for coordinated violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. That's when my attorney sent the third letter. This one was shorter but more pointed. It reminded the board that they could not retroactively change the rules or create new regulations without following proper amendment procedures. It also noted that trying to fine multiple homeowners for using paint from an explicitly approved manufacturer would constitute clear evidence of bad faith enforcement. The letter concluded with a formal demand that the board either approve all the HOA blue paint jobs or face individual lawsuits from every affected homeowner. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. I decided to attend. The community center was packed. Word had gotten out about the paint controversy, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up to see what would happen. I sat in the back with my stack of legal documents and watched the show. The board president opened the meeting by explaining that recent paint color choices had created visual chaos in the neighborhood and that immediate action was needed to restore aesthetic harmony. That's when the homeowner with the light HOA blue Colonial stood up and asked a simple question. If Heritage Tints was an approved manufacturer in 1987, and HOA Color Standards Corporation was the legal successor to Heritage Tints, then how could paint from that company be considered non-compliant? The board president stuttered and said she would need to consult with their attorney. The homeowner with the sage HOA Blue Craftsman house stood up next. She pointed out that her color was actually more muted and historically appropriate than the bright white trim that had been approved for the Victorian house across the street. More questions followed. Why were some historically appropriate colors acceptable while others were not? What specific criteria were being used to evaluate paint colors? Where in the HOA documents did it say that neighbors had to coordinate their color choices? The board president grew more flustered with each question. Finally, she announced that the board would need time to research the legal issues and would provide a response within 30 days. That was 3 months ago. I never received an official response to my letters. The threatened fines never materialized. The board president announced her resignation 2 weeks after the meeting, citing personal reasons and irreconcilable differences with current board procedures. 2 other board members resigned the following month. In the special election that followed, I was approached by several neighbors who suggested I should run for the board myself. I declined, but I did endorse a slate of candidates who were committed to modernizing the HOA rules and ending the arbitrary enforcement that had characterized the previous administration. All 3 of my endorsed candidates won by wide margins. The new board's first official action was to update the approved manufacturer list for the first time in 37 years. They also created clear, objective criteria for evaluating paint colors and established an appeals process for homeowners who felt their applications had been unfairly rejected. But here's the really satisfying part. HOA Color Standards Corporation has become genuinely successful. Word of my story spread through social media and local news, and I started getting orders from other HOAs across the state. Apparently, there are a lot of communities struggling with overly restrictive paint color rules, and my historically accurate alternatives have found a ready market. I've expanded the color line to include shades specifically designed for different architectural styles: Federal Blue for colonial homes, Prairie Gold for craftsman houses, Mission Red for Spanish revivals. Each color comes with historical documentation and technical specifications that make it easy for homeowners to get HOA approval. The irony is not lost on me. I'm now making money from the very situation that started this whole controversy. What began as a simple desire to paint my house the right color has turned into a thriving business based on helping other people navigate arbitrary HOA restrictions. My house looks exactly the way I wanted it to. The deep Mediterranean blue, now officially known as HOA blue, is perfect against the terracotta tiles and cream stucco. Neighbors regularly stop by to compliment the color choice and ask about my paint company. But the best part is sitting on my front porch in the evening, looking down the street at all the different houses painted in various shades of HOA blue. What was once a monotonous stretch of beige houses has become a diverse, vibrant neighborhood where each home's architectural character is highlighted rather than suppressed. The former board president moved out of the neighborhood 6 months after resigning. I heard through the community grapevine that she was having trouble with her new HOA because they wouldn't let her paint her house the exact shade of beige she wanted. I would have felt sorry for her, but karma has a way of working these things out. Sometimes the only way to beat arbitrary authority is to use their own rules against them, but with a bigger budget and a smarter strategy. The key is understanding that bureaucratic tyrants rely on other people not knowing the rules as well as they do. Once you level that playing field, their power evaporates pretty quickly. The legal costs for this whole project ended up being less than what I spent on paint. The paint company has already generated enough profit to cover its purchase price twice over, and my house is painted exactly the color it was meant to be. But the real victory is watching other homeowners realize that they don't have to accept arbitrary restrictions just because someone in authority says so. Knowledge of the rules, proper documentation, and strategic thinking can overcome petty tyranny every time. My wife still thinks I went a little overboard buying an entire paint company just to win an argument with the HOA. She's probably right. But as I tell her every time we get another order from a customer who heard about our story, sometimes the best revenge is the kind that pays for itself. The neighborhood has settled into its new normal now. People choose paint colors based on what looks good with their architectural style rather than what appears on some arbitrary approved list. The new HOA board focuses on actual maintenance issues instead of micromanaging everyone's aesthetic choices. And every time I see another house painted in one of my historically appropriate colors, I remember why I started this whole project in the first place. It was never really about the paint. It was about the principle that arbitrary authority should not go unchallenged, especially when it serves no legitimate purpose. The former board president had built her little empire on the assumption that homeowners would just comply with whatever restrictions she imposed, regardless of how unreasonable they were. She counted on people being too busy or too intimidated to fight back effectively. She was wrong about me. I had the knowledge, resources, and determination to turn her own rules against her. More importantly, I had the patience to do it right. No angry confrontations, no violation of HOA procedures, no giving her any excuse to claim I was the unreasonable one. Just careful research, strategic planning, and flawless execution. The paint on my house still looks perfect 18 months later. The HOA blue color has aged beautifully, and the quality of the paint I chose means it will probably look good for another decade. Every time I pull into my driveway, I feel satisfied not just with how the house looks, but with how the whole situation played out. I proved that you can fight arbitrary authority and win, as long as you're willing to put in the work to do it right. And the fact that I'm making money from the experience is just the cherry on top of an already perfect outcome. My neighbors have started calling me the paint color revolutionary, which is probably the strangest nickname I've ever earned. But I wear it with pride. After all, revolutions don't always require violence or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they just require someone who knows how to read the fine print and has the resources to turn bureaucratic weapons against the bureaucrats themselves. The HOA Blue Paint Company has given me something I never expected when I started this fight. Not just a successful business, but a way to help other people deal with the same kind of arbitrary restrictions that I faced. Every customer who orders historically appropriate paint from my company is someone who's taking back a little bit of control from an overly restrictive HOA. Every house that gets painted in a color that actually makes sense for its architectural style is a small victory against the tyranny of beige. And every time I get a thank you letter from a customer who successfully got approval for their paint project using documentation from HOA Color Standards Corporation, I'm reminded that the best way to fight bad rules is often to follow them better than the people who made them. The story could have ended differently if I had just accepted the initial rejection and painted my house one of the approved beige colors. I would have saved time, money, and effort. My house would still look fine, just not as good as it does now, but I would have missed the opportunity to prove that arbitrary authority only works when people are willing to accept it without question. Now I have a beautiful house painted exactly the right color, a profitable business that helps other people navigate HOA restrictions, and the satisfaction of knowing that I stood up to bureaucratic tyranny and won. Most importantly, I learned that the best revenge is the kind that makes everything better for everyone except the people who were abusing their authority in the first place. The former board president lost her power, her credibility, and eventually her place in the neighborhood. The arbitrary restrictions that she had used to control other people's choices were replaced with reasonable, objective standards. Meanwhile, homeowners got more freedom to choose appropriate colors for their houses, the neighborhood looks more vibrant and historically accurate, and I got a successful business out of the deal. That's what real victory looks like. Not just beating the people who wronged you, but creating a better situation for everyone while making sure the problem can't happen again. The HOA Blue story has become something of a legend in our area. I get invited to speak at homeowner meetings, and other entrepreneurs have asked me for advice about dealing with restrictive regulations in their own industries. My message is always the same. Know the rules better than the people enforcing them. Document everything. Think strategically instead of emotionally, and remember that the most effective way to fight arbitrary power is often to use that power's own tools against it. But mostly, I tell people to paint their houses whatever color makes them happy, as long as they can back up their choice with proper documentation and legal compliance. Because in the end, it's your house. You should get to choose what color it is, even if that means buying a paint company to make sure your choice is properly approved. The next one is a malicious compliance story. A year ago, I got fired from a job as efficiency lead. It happened a week after I noted that I was going to become a father, but that's another aspect. The reason I was hired was to dig deeper into company issues, finding the root cause. My manager was thrilled to have an actual FBA on board. Cue her assistant manager. Since I needed to learn the ins and outs, she got me into spending 70% of my time into useless tracking that she needed for her glorious monthly pivot tables. The thing is that noting down of post-its, mails, and several other influx into a spreadsheet got me some very much needed insight. Either, for example, the printers were moved every month from one site to the other, or there was a huge flaw. Some if those flaws would be considered huge flags for the equivalent of IRS. When I started tracking them, as my job was exactly that, the AM tried to block me from several internal data. Since the manager and her assistant were pretty close, I tried to get the actual department from said flaws in the loop. Less than a week later, the manager asked why I was snooping around other departments. Meanwhile, everyone I spoke to at other departments were more than helpful in gathering information, even speaking to counterparts at other sites. 2 days later, she notified me she asked IT for a full copy of my mailbox, against the law, and was not amused. Henceforth, I had to include her in every mail I send and had to write down by the minute on every case file I was working on. The last one was the easiest malicious compliance. When I got a call, I noted it. When I went to get a coffee, I noted internal movements, even someone sticking his head inside the door to say hi. She got an Excel sheet with about 600 lines a day, including a line after each entry for filling out the sheet. After 3 days, she was furious and wasn't taking things serious. Of course I wasn't, but she didn't have to know. I asked her to email me on the specifics she wanted me to write down and asked for a route path on every project. With a "you know what I want," she stormed off. I got an email from HR for a talk, told them everything, including my notes on every meeting. They asked me to just set up a spreadsheet with a total per day on every project and mailed it to the manager, including the note that I needed the information her assistant had blocked me from. The including in the email part was fairly simple. It was about 10% of my total conversations. When the manager went on vacation, she said she liked the new way of working and told me to push on 3 main issues I laid out. And of course, the assistant took her chance to get into the high chair. The mails were not adequate, so I had to send her a full report on any conversation. It started innocent, till I got to an old file with the signature of the assistant and several site managers. I started calling them and asked about the information listed. After about 5 phone calls and a small note mailed to the assistant, she stormed into the shared office calling me a no-good golden retriever trying to find truffles in muck water. She demanded a full report on any coming call. Cue malicious compliance number 2. I started using voice-to-text software to make full transcripts on any call. Even a question about something like, "How is the now cleaning lady doing?" was fully written down. Imagine receiving an average of 4 hours a day of transcription. Because of the flooding, she missed the pattern about the €1,000,000 issue I was gently going towards. When the manager came back, the assistant told her I was harassing her. Even without a chance to give a reply, I received an official letter at my house about an inquiry. The inquiry was the manager, someone from HR, and someone from the European chair. To top it all off, the assistant manager had given the manager a list of confidential documents that I have stolen from her private laptop, including that old file sitting somewhere on the server. When they asked why I needed that file, I started pointing out that the file was pointing to a huge flaw concerning legal documents and payments, the exact thing I was hired for. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that I was going out the door within a few days, so I started rattling up the cage. I read my initial job description and the internal guidelines to the role. The two guys I was working with went into a frenzy to find any consequent from that error. Site manager were alerted. Accounting started making calculations. The last email that I received was probably sent too early. OP falsified several documents on the server to get manager and assistant manager into trouble. Any communication should be deleted by the end of the day. Needless to say, I had to pack my things. 3 months later, I met some guys from the company. Turned out the damage was done, but the cover-up was even better. The avalanche of people involved that quit was undeniable, and some departments involved had over 50% of workforce sitting at home due to mental issues. The duo still works there, sitting on a lie that can still cost the firm millions a year since they still haven't solved the issue. The next one is an entitled people story. I worked in electrical retail in a mall in England back when the Wii console first came out. When it was first released, if you are old enough, you'll remember that the handsets didn't come with a safety strap attached at all. You just held it in your hand loose to play the games. It had a thin strap with it, but no one ever attached them. So about 3 days after the release of the Wii, a couple came into the store literally carrying their big LED TV, seriously high-tech at the time and very pricey, under their arm, and put it on the counter of customer services and demanded to see the manager. Sadly, this was before the Karen name tag existed. We asked them what the problem was, and they pointed to the giant crack on the TV screen and said it had just mysteriously broken. We said that unless they had an extra warranty, that accidental damage was not covered. They replied all snootily that the TV just broke. The kid with them sniggered. They refused to talk more unless to a manager. It was busy, so he'd be a while. I told them to browse. They left the kid with me. Gee, thanks. So I chatted a bit to the kid till I softened him up. Then I straight up asked the kid, 9 or so, what really happened. He said, well, I was using my new Wii, and the remote flew out of my hand whilst I was playing 10-pin bowling, and it crashed into the screen on the wall and smashed it. I was utterly astounded. Luckily, a coworker had also heard what the kid said. At that point, the manager came up to me, and before the parents could come storming back over, I quickly told him the real story. Then the parents arrived and began to bullcrap the manager utterly. The screen just broke whilst we were out. Manager was a good bloke and said, well, your kid just told us that the Wii remote flew out of his hand into the screen. Cue parents looking at the kid like he was going to be grounded for a year. The kid was still smirking, as 9-year-old lil craps are bound to do when getting someone else into trouble. Whilst this was going on, I actually had taken the time to look at the back of the TV and saw that it wasn't even a model number that we sold. I quickly turned to my manager and said, this TV isn't even one we sell here. The manager looked at parents and asked what exactly they thought we could do if the telly wasn't from this store. They both started yelling over each other, saying that it was all our fault and that they shouldn't have to replace it, but still trying to say nothing about the Wii. Our manager stonily said that there was literally nothing we could do as they hadn't even bought it from us, so how could we replace it? They were both so cross lines and agitated that they started being utter Karens and crafty at us. I could tell manager was 5 seconds from calling mall security when the dad said, well, we bought the Wii from you, and that was what caused the accident, so you have to replace it. So you do admit it was an accident caused by your kid on his Wii? The parents both just looked at each other, and the mum looked so pissed at Dad. And the mum took the kid's wrist and went to storm out of the shop, shouting at Dad to follow them. My manager called after them, hey, you can't leave the TV here, it's littering. I think he just pulled that out of nowhere because he was utterly pissed off by that point. If you leave the TV here, we'll contact mall security and you'll be banned from the entire mall. There were other malls in the city, but ours was the biggest with all the best stores. Dad just huffs and comes to retrieve it, and they both get escorted out of the store by our own security. A few weeks later, Nintendo sent out stickers to put on all the Wii boxes to always attach a safety strap, and a few months later, all Wii remotes started being shipped with straps attached already. I think there were a lot of broken TVs at this point, but I bet we were the only store to have a couple ask for a new TV at a store they never even bought it from. The next one is an entitled parent story. I, 33M, do not have the best relationship with my father. In fact, I resent him. It wasn't always like this. There was a time where I probably would have helped him bury the bodies if he asked me to. But now, I can't look at or think about him without getting heated. This story goes back to 2011 when I got accepted into college. It wasn't my first choice, but it was a good school and I was proud. A little background. I was diagnosed with severe ADHD as a kid and had a learning disability. For me, college was a dream. My mother went Ivy League, and my father was a 2 ND Gen college student, so higher ed was an expectation on my fam. As a kid, my first grade once said in front of the whole class that I'd never go to college and would be lucky to get a job flipping burgers at BK. Seriously, duck that idiot. I worked hard in high school, took honors AP classes, played football, and eventually got into 3 universities, choosing my safe school mostly to get some independence from home. When I got my acceptance letter, everyone was happy, especially my father. But the next day, he changed. He started by pushing me to join Afro TC, I wasn't interested, and then to major in engineering. I've never been into math or science. My passion was history. But he pushed hard. He got family, friends, and engineers to pressure me too. His game plan, as he put it, was simple. Here's the plan. He told me with his crap-eating grin, "You're going to take engineering. That way you can get a great job after college. And once you get that job, I won't pay your loans." It sounded practical, but I still wasn't interested. He turned the whole college road into being about him, dictating clubs, stopping me from playing football, even forcing me into a crappy minimum wage union job that ate into my checks. I finally put my foot down and said that I was taking history. He looked like I'd canceled Xmas. 2 weeks later, he gave me the ultimatum. I pay the piper, I pick the tune. If I didn't do engineering, he'd cut off my college fund. Backed into a corner, I gave in. I hated every second of it. I was miserable, behind in my classes, exhausted and ashamed. Eventually, I switched to poli-sci, since I'd always been interested in law. When I told my dad, I expected some understanding. Instead, he looked me in the eye and said, "You should have cut yourself off from the family." That broke me. He called me selfish, reckless, reminded me he was my benefactor, and still demanded the right to control me. From there, things only got worse. Fighting, manipulation, snooping, gaslighting, even using my autistic bro to dig my transcripts. At one point, I attempted suicide. When I told Dad, his response was basically, he was glad I didn't go through with it because otherwise he'd have to pay for a funeral. That's my dad for you. Years passed. I blocked him for a while, eventually only emailed. I didn't invite him to graduation. When I later ranted to my mom about how much I resented him, he overheard on speakerphone. He was shocked and hurt that I felt that way. I half apologized just to keep family peace. Fast forward. I am now a homeowner, engaged to an amazing woman and working toward law school. My dad found out about my engagement through a family friend. Recently, since he retired, he's been trying to rebuild our relationship. Against my better judgment, I let him visit. I set simple boundaries, and he agreed. But during the trip, he spilled kombucha all over my carpet, got mad at me for being upset, and didn't even try to clean it. Made me wait 15 minutes at a golf course because he was drinking with strangers. Criticized my house and suggested upgrades that he wouldn't pay for. Called me his dinner companion during a business call instead of his son. Passed out drunk while nearly burning down my kitchen by leaving chili on the stove. I completely lost it on him. By the end, I told him flat out that I don't trust him. That he's selfish, self-righteous, and throws tantrums when he doesn't head his way. If he weren't family, I would have cut him out years ago. I drove him to the airport the next morning. No hug, no goodbye, just walked off. Now he wants to try again, but I honestly don't see the point. He destroyed my trust years ago, nothing has changed. Anyway, thank you for watching.